welcome back. So, I'm going to focus in excruciating detail on two papers that Maslow published in 1943. The first is a Preface to Motivation Theory, and the second is his seminal psychological review paper, A Theory to Motivation. Now, A Preface to Motivation Theory is a paper that is not talked about that much when you hear about Maslow's theory, but I feel it's very important because what it does is it outlines his theoretical assumptions, essentially the reasons why, the things that he felt were important, for why you needed to integrate biological and psychological perspectives for essentially a unified theory of human motivation, which at the time was radical, hugely radical. We kind of take it for granted, particularly if you have something other than an MD. Sorry, my MD friends, but MDs continue to push the biological reductionist perspective that everything can be boiled down to biological perspectives, whereas psychologists believe that we, in more Gestalt principles, not that biology is unimportant, but we do believe that we are greater than the sum of our parts, that you can boil us down biologically and you still will not come anywhere close to understanding the concept of love, so that we do transcend our biology to some extent. How and why that occurs, we don't know, and we may never know. But that's a tension that exists between a psychological approach to understanding human behavior and a biological approach to understanding human behavior. It was there in the 40s, and it's here now, 80 years later. And what Maslow attempted to do was, at least within the study of human motivation, try to come up with a way of unifying these two very different, diametrically opposed perspectives. One that said biology rules everything, screw everything else, and the other that said we can't learn anything about human behavior from understanding biology, which is essentially what was a growing movement within psychology at the time. So understanding his reasoning for developing a unified theory of motivation, I think, is key to setting the stage for his psychological review paper and understanding the 5 basic needs. So with that in mind, let us go into Maslow's Preface to Motivation Theory, published in Psychosomatic Medicine in 1943. So, and again, I apologize for all of the words. Again, you can go find these papers for yourself if you want to get into the more specifics of them. But I felt it was important to kind of just get a sense of what he's trying to say. Now, what Maslow said was important were, and he outlined, essentially, I'm summarizing here, but he essentially outlined 13 reasons. I hate to say it, 13 reasons why. 13 reasons for integrating biological and non-biological perspectives. What he called animal-centered and human-centered perspectives. The first is that it's the only way to move the field forward. that an integrative model is by definition the foundational cornerstone for any general theory of motivation. And this falls into a broader contextual movement within science in general, a unified theory. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about physics or what Freud was trying to do. Freud was a unified theory. When you're talking about a unified general theory, you're talking about integrating different perspectives. And at least in the study of motivation, that is where he was coming from. You needed to integrate these different perspectives. This, for me, is key to everything that Maslow argued. And it is antithetical to the current pyramid. He said, you can't focus on physiological drives as the centering point for human motivation. You got to take them as given. And if you just give more than 2 neurons to thinking about it, it makes sense. If you're at a point in your life where you're even contemplating making a friend, then yeah, you've had enough food. It's a given. That's been met. You know, you've had enough to drink. You've slept. Maybe not enough, but how are you defining enough? The physiological drives, he rejected them as the centering point for human motivation. Of course, physiological drives are important. They're a biological necessity, an imperative, one would say. But to say that you have to have them satisfied in order to love and to have self-esteem and to satisfy psychological drives? That's self-evident because they're basic survival drives. Of course you've got to be alive in order to fall in love. Duh! So they're off the table. Because in order to have any psychological drive fulfilled, you've first got to survive. So in his mind, it made no sense to have physiological drives as the center of any model of human motivation. He also rejected the idea of coming up with generating lists of any type of need, like a need for achievement, a need for mastery, a blah, 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 blah. He said that any model should stress the goal, not the way to achieve the goal. Because there are multiple ways to achieve a goal. Focusing on how to achieve the goal, that's a distraction. Because those are culturally determined. Those are influenced by the situation context in which one finds themselves. Those are influenced by socioeconomic status. What matters is the goal itself. Plus, the goal is what's common across individuals, across people, across culture. How that goal is achieved is environmentally and socially and culturally determined. But the goal in and of itself, that is universal. That basic idea, that is very Freudian. In fact, it's what Freud said. He said, do not forsake the id. That there are these basic underlying needs. Freud called them. He had 2 needs, a need to create and a need to destroy, thanatos and libido. Ultimately, Maslow respectfully disagreed and said there were 5, but it's the same thing. Do not forsake them. Focus on these 5. He said that the basic unconscious goals, these 5 needs, are what's important. Not necessarily how, again, not how they are necessarily achieved, how they are fulfilled. Yes, how they are fulfilled, but the manner within which they are fulfilled. And that, yes, there are overlapping local cultural desires that can impact them. But it's the commonality of these unconscious goals that drive human behavior. And he noted a simple truth that motivated behavior, and he did note that all behavior is motivated, but that motivated behavior is simply a way to express and satisfy these 5 basic needs. That all behavior, on some level, is geared towards satisfying one or more of these basic needs, either individually, collectively, but that inextricably they are linked. Okay, let's move on to the next ones. All organismic states are motivating. What does he mean by that? That all behavior is geared towards satisfying these 5 basic needs. That's it. That's all that drives us. All behavior is geared towards satisfying these 5 basic needs. And here's where people get, I think, hung up on this hierarchy. Because he does say that there's a hierarchy. But the hierarchy has absolutely nothing to do directly with the 5 basic needs. And he first hints at this idea in the Preface to Motivation Theory. He says that the needs arrange themselves in hierarchies of prepotency. Every drive is linked to the satisfaction or lack thereof of every other drive. So one drive is linked to another drive. Satisfying one drive is linked to another drive. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to activate another drive, but it may or it may not. It just says that they're linked. Every drive is linked to the satisfaction or lack thereof of another drive. He does say, interestingly enough, that we are in a perpetually wanting state. We are never completely ever satisfied. Hence, all behavior is motivated to satisfy. Now, what does he mean by this hierarchy of prepotency? What is prepotency? As I will argue later on, prepotency refers to our ability to pull these needs out of our unconscious mind. Remember, this is a very Freudian-based model. Not Freudian in terms of phallic stages, penis envy, all of that stuff. Freudian in terms of the structure of the human personality. Unconscious, subconscious, preconscious, conscious. According to Maslow, all of these 5 needs are unconscious. We have no direct awareness of them at any given moment in time. Doesn't mean we can't become aware of them. But the ease with which we can become aware of them, that's what he means by prepotency. And what the hierarchy refers to is how smushed down, how deep they are pushed into the unconscious mind. And the physiological needs, they are pushed so far fricking down. And we'll get to this later on. So what the hierarchy actually refers to is how far down in the unconscious mind the needs are pushed. Okay? Now, again, no practical or theoretical purpose in listing needs, so his model is going to focus just on the levels, hence just on the 5. And then finally, any theory of motivation unified because of his idea that you don't center things on physiological because they're a given. It should be centered on people. It should be centered on, yes, we're going to use the same mechanisms, in his case, a focus on homeostasis, but focus on what drives people to behave the way that they do, to achieve or satisfy these 5 basic needs. So, these last 3 are in many ways, for me at least, some of the most important and some of the least paid attention to. For me, most important because they are another level of integration because they integrate his work with basic social psychology and the work of Kurt Lewin. So when you take into account how an individual behaves, it needs to be done within the context within which that individual behaves. So the situation or the field within which the person reacts must be taken into account because a person doesn't behave within a vacuum. The possibility of isolated, specific, partial, or segmented reactions must be taken into account. Here's an example of what I talk about when I talk about how we just unconsciously mold and shape and change our reactions. So you're sitting in a baseball game, and you know your friend is like 3 people down from you, and you say, "Hey, Bob, pass the fucking beer," and he passes the beer. And let's just say you're sitting. It's coming up in a couple weeks, right? You're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner across the table. You go to your mom. You say, "Hey, Mom, pass the fucking mashed potatoes." No. Do you consciously think about it? Do you go, should I yell at my mother to pass the effing mashed potatoes? You don't. We automatically modify, change our behavior, our mannerisms, our language, everything based on environmental context. That's what social psychologists have been saying for decades. That's what Maslow said back in 1943. And that's exactly, I mean, it's true. We don't even think about it. It's what happened. And he said you need to take it into account when you talk about a general model of human motivation. And he's right. And even on a broader level, his last point, behavior is almost always biologically, culturally, and situationally determined. Maslow said that. And you sure as hell wouldn't know that when you're looking at the darn pyramid now, would you? Now, with all of those precepts, his preconditions for developing a general, integrated, unified theory of human motivation, let us now move into what Maslow wrote back in 1943, his psychological review paper, A Theory of Motivation.